If you have Scottish ancestry, and your family has been in America since the 1600s or 1700s, there is a possibility your family history has never told you. Not because the records don't exist, because nobody wanted to talk about it. Your Scottish ancestor may not have chosen to come to America. They may have been put on a ship in chains, transported as a prisoner of war, and sold into indentured servitude in the colonies. Their identity stripped, their origin deliberately obscured, their descendants left with a family tree that simply begins in the New World with no explanation of how they got there. To understand how Scottish prisoners ended up in America, you need to understand the specific military conflicts that produced them. There were three. The first was the Battle of Dunbar in 1650, Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army. The parliamentary force that had already executed King Charles I, marched into Scotland and met a Scottish Covenanting army outside the town of Dunbar in East Lothian on September 3rd. The battle lasted less than an hour. Cromwell's forces were outnumbered, but caught the Scots in a catastrophically poor tactical position. Approximately 3,000 Scots were killed on the field. Another 10,000 were taken prisoner. Those 10,000 prisoners were marched south into England in conditions that killed them faster than the battle had. Poorly fed, poorly clothed, driven through an early autumn that turned cold within weeks. By the time they reached England, roughly 5,000 had died of dysentery, starvation, and exposure. The survivors were concentrated in Durham Cathedral, where they were held in conditions so brutal that another 1,500 died in captivity within months. Of the original 10,000 prisoners taken at Dunbar, fewer than 3,000 survived long enough to be transported. The second conflict was the Battle of Worcester in 1651. Cromwell's final defeat of the Royalist forces, which included a significant Scottish contingent fighting for the exiled King Charles II. Thousands more Scottish prisoners were taken. The third and most politically charged was the aftermath of the Jacobite risings, particularly the Rising of 1715 and the catastrophic defeat at Culloden in 1746, which produced the largest single wave of Scottish political prisoners in history. Each conflict, thousands of prisoners, and for all of them, the same solution: transportation. Transportation of prisoners to the American colonies was not an informal or improvised process. It was a deliberate, financially motivated system that operated with administrative efficiency. Scottish prisoners from Dunbar and Worcester were sold. The word is not used loosely. To New England merchants and Virginia plantation owners who needed labor for the colonial economy. The transaction was straightforward. The English government offloaded the cost and responsibility of housing prisoners. Colonial merchants received workers who had no legal rights, no freedom of movement, and no means of return. The prisoners received their lives, technically, in exchange for 7 to 10 years of indentured servitude. After the indenture period expired, they were theoretically free. In practice, many had nowhere to go. Scotland was occupied by Cromwellian forces. They had no money for passage home, no guarantee of safety if they returned, and in some cases, no family left to return to. Many stayed, married, had children, became the founding generation of Scottish American families, whose descendants are still in New England, Virginia, and the Carolinas today. The Jacobite transportation was different in character, but similar in mechanism. After Culloden in 1746, the British government transported surviving Jacobite rebels, men who had fought for the Stuart claim to the throne, to the American colonies under sentences of transportation for life or for terms of 14 years. Unlike the Dunbar prisoners who were sold as indentured laborers, Jacobite transportees were classified as convicted traitors. Their estates were forfeited. Their clan identities were criminalized under the Act of Prescription, which banned Highland dress, the playing of bagpipes, and the carrying of weapons. They arrived in America as men stripped of everything that had defined them. The Dunbar and Worcester prisoners were distributed primarily across 3 colonial destinations: New England, specifically Massachusetts Bay Colony, received the largest contingent. Several hundred Scottish prisoners arrived in Boston between 1651 and 1652, many of whom were put to work in the ironworks at Saugus and Lynn, in the timber industry, and on farms across Massachusetts and Maine. Their descendants are documented across New England today, concentrated in family names that appear suddenly in Massachusetts records in the early 1650s, with no prior colonial history behind them. Virginia received a significant share, where Scottish prisoners were put to work on tobacco plantations. The conditions in Virginia were in some respects harsher than New England. The climate unfamiliar, the plantation labor brutal, the social structure offering fewer paths to eventual independence than the more diversified New England economy. Barbados received a portion as well. Scottish prisoners transported to the Caribbean sugar plantations, where survival rates were dramatically lower than on the mainland colonies. The Barbados transportation is the least documented and the most brutal chapter of the prisoner story, with records suggesting mortality rates that made survival to the end of an indentured term genuinely exceptional. After Culloden, the Jacobite transportees went primarily to the American South, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, where many integrated into the Scots-Irish communities already established in the backcountry and Appalachian regions. Some managed to build lives of genuine substance. Others disappeared into the colonial labor system without leaving a traceable record. Here is why this history is so difficult to trace, and why so many American families with Scottish ancestry have no idea it applies to them. The transportation system had every incentive to obscure the origins of the people it moved. Prisoners who arrived as convicted rebels or indentured laborers were not always recorded accurately. Ship manifests were inconsistent. Names were anglicized, misspelled, or simply omitted. A Scottish prisoner named Alistair McGillivray might appear in a Virginia county record as Alexander Gillespie, phonetically approximated by an English clerk who had no interest in Gaelic orthography and every interest in administrative efficiency. The prisoners themselves had reasons to obscure their origins. A man transported as a convicted Jacobite rebel who survived his sentence and built a new life in the colonies had every incentive to let his political past disappear. His children grew up as American colonists, not as Scottish rebels. By the third generation, the family story had often been simplified to "our family came from Scotland," with the circumstances of how and why quietly dropped. The Scottish cultural suppression also played a role. After Culloden, Highland identity was legally criminalized in Scotland itself. Families who had escaped transportation but had Jacobite connections learned quickly to downplay them. That same instinct, "don't talk about it, don't draw attention," crossed the Atlantic with the transported prisoners and became embedded in family culture for generations. If you have Scottish ancestry and your family appears in American colonial records before 1760, there are specific indicators worth investigating. The first is timing. Scottish surnames appearing in New England records in the early 1650s, particularly in Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire, are disproportionately likely to trace to Dunbar or Worcester prisoners. There are specific documented lists of prisoner ships and their passenger rosters that researchers have cross-referenced with colonial census and land records. If your ancestor's name appears on one of those lists, the connection is documented rather than speculative. The second is geographic clustering. Dunbar prisoners were concentrated in specific colonial industries: the Saugus Ironworks, the Lynn shoe trade, the Massachusetts timber industry. If your early Scottish-American ancestor was a tradesman or industrial worker in New England in the 1650s, rather than a landed colonist, the probability of prisoner origin is elevated. The third is surname mutation. If your Scottish surname appears in colonial records in a slightly different, anglicized, or phonetically altered form compared to the original Gaelic or Scots version, And if that altered form appears suddenly in the 1650s or post-1746 period with no earlier colonial history, you may be looking at a name that was recorded by an English clerk who didn't know how to spell it correctly. The records exist. Colonial archives, ship manifests, ironworks employment records, indenture contracts, county land grants. The documentary trail is incomplete but navigable. If your family tree has a wall somewhere in the early colonial period, there may be a very specific historical reason why. If you have Scottish ancestry and your American family line begins in the early colonial period with no clear explanation of how or why they came, this is where you look. Not the romantic story of a free emigrant seeking opportunity. Not the Scots-Irish Presbyterian settler moving into the backcountry by choice. A prisoner. A man or woman put on a ship against their will. Sold into labor in a foreign land. Who survived it. Built something from nothing. And left descendants who carried the bloodline forward without ever knowing what it had cost to get there. That is not a shameful history. That is a survival story. And it belongs to more American families than have ever been told. Subscribe. See ya.